The Renaissance period, 14th to 17th centuries, was one of vast cultural, intellectual, and economic change, and along with it, some quite interesting and bizarre occupations. Below are a few of the stranger or more unusual jobs that occurred or flourished during the period. But under the majesty of Michelangelo's statues and Galileo's lenses were a universe of strange occupations, occupations which look absurd by today's measurements, but were vital to the social, cultural, and economic landscape of the period. 1. Court jester. The court jester was more than a simple entertainer. Challenged with entertaining royalty with jokes, imitation, and satire, jesters held an ironic position, low but favored. They were among the few persons who were allowed to deride kings without retribution, employing humor to cover truth. In most courts, jesters doubled as unofficial counselors, providing advice in disguise as folly. But not every jester lived in ease. They were treated as simple, fools, ridiculed or ill-treated depending on whether they failed to amuse. They hung in the balance depending on the disposition of their master and the time of day. Finally, the Renaissance royal fool was a paradox, low status but high power, seeming foolish but wise in words. Their legacy lives on as a warning that humor is potent. 2. The alchemist. Alchemists were the Renaissance mystic scientists. They sought above all to change base metals into gold and find the mysterious elixir of life. Alchemists' experimentation never produced material outcomes, yet they laid the groundwork for the development of chemistry and medicine. Alchemists worked in secret, combining spiritual philosophy with empirical research. Their bizarre concoctions and cryptic notebooks made them respected and feared. Alchemists worked in mysterious laboratories, packed with flasks, furnaces, and mysterious symbols. What they perceived as their work was a mystery, usually written in cipher to conceal their knowledge. They were said to believe in the four elements of antiquity, earth, air, fire, and water, and it was their idea that through the purification of substances, life could also be purified. That spiritual belief turned alchemy into something not only a science, but a philosophical quest. Alchemists weren't simply messing around with chemicals, they were pursuing immortality, attempting to perfect gold, and hunting for spiritual secrets. That mix of science, religion, and enchantment makes it seem more like something from a fantasy book than an actual profession. 3. The professional mourner. In aristocratic society, mourning was not only individual, it was also performative. There were professional mourners, usually women, who were hired to weep, wail, and bewail at funerals. Theirs were over-the-top demonstrations of grief to commemorate the deceased and show respect to the family's standing. This occupation indicates the Renaissance preoccupation with appearance and ritualism, where even mourning became a public performance. Nowadays, paying someone to weep at a funeral would seem weird, but during the Renaissance, it was an esteemed, if strange, profession. It illustrates how societies have both traditionally employed ritual and performance to make death, grief, and memory manageable. In Renaissance Europe, particularly among the nobility, funerals were not merely intimate goodbyes. They were public spectacles of status, feeling, and ritual. The larger the number of mourners and the more melodramatic their mourning, the more prestigious the deceased seemed. Professional mourners were hired to wail with great abandon, cry, pound their chests, and occasionally recite poetic eulogies. Their over-the-top grief provided a setting for a sense of formality and emotional catharsis. While their work could be viewed as theatrical or dishonest, professional mourners filled an actual psychological and social role. They facilitated bereaved families to articulate feelings that could otherwise remain pent up, and funerals were ensured to fulfill cultural standards of respectability. 4. The rat catcher. Renaissance urbanization resulted in a rise in rodent infestations, particularly in crowded cities. The lives of public health relied on rat catchers, but they were primitive in their means and unsanitary in practice. Equipped with traps, poisons, and even trained animals, they crawled through sewers and alleys, exposing themselves to disease and injury. Socially marginalized, they were regarded as necessary evils, not liked but tolerated. In recent times, the ratcatcher has been reinterpreted in literature and film. In Wes Anderson's 2023 adaptation of Roald Dahl's The Ratcatcher is a strange exterminator whose master plan to poison rats is foiled. Ralph Fiennes plays the character, who becomes a tragicomic figure, obsessive, assertive, and finally beaten by the creatures he wants to dominate. The ratcatcher, real or imagined, signifies something greater than pest control. He is the symbol of the desire of man to impose order on chaos, of the fight against nature, and the irony of being outwitted by the inferior. He is a figure for all versions, haunting, part hero, part fool, and completely indelible. Their job was dirty and risky, and their standing did not improve. But they were vital, unheralded heroes of sanitation and survival. The ratcatcher is also to be found in folklore, perhaps most famously of all in the legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin. In this legend, the ratcatcher is an enchanting one who entices rats away with music. When the town people betray him, he repays them by piping their children away. 5. The wet nurse. Wet nurses were hired by rich families to suckle their babies, sometimes for years. This enabled noblewomen to have social lives while keeping their children well fed. The work was personal and physically intense, and wet nurses sometimes grew close to the children they cared for. They were also under tight contracts and moral judgment, particularly concerning their own health and fertility. In the past, wet nurses tended to be of lower social status. They abandoned their own children for good in some cases in order to live in their employers' homes. Their bodies became instruments of service, and their milk was life-giving yet symbolic of class divisions. In certain societies, the relationship established by nursing was so close that wet nurses were viewed as part of the extended family, and in others were regarded as servants. In literature and art, wet nurses are usually depicted as maternal figures, at times more caring than the biological mother. Shakespeare's Juliet, for instance, is closer to her nurse than to her own family. This speaks to the role's emotional depth, where employed care might transform into real love. Now, the wet nurse is all but extinct in most cultures, replaced by formula and contemporary childcare. But her legacy lives on as a metaphor for sacrifice, class relations, and the intimate work of motherhood. She teaches us that caregiving is not always biological, and that care, in all its permutations, makes the earliest human bonds. 6. The tooth puller. The tooth puller was ubiquitous in Renaissance and Baroque Europe. Tooth extraction, before it became a respectable medical specialty, was typically done by traveling quacks, barber surgeons, or street entertainers who operated in public squares, providing immediate relief from toothache, sometimes with dubious technique and theatrics. Tooth pulling was as much a spectacle as a medical procedure. People stood in crowds to witness the agonizing process, which was usually done to the accompaniment of music, humor, and inflated melodrama. A tooth puller's reputation rested less on qualifications and more on personality and swagger. Some produced spurious certificates or displayed sets of teeth that were extracted as evidence of their expertise. The tooth puller represents an era when curing was spectacular and agony was a shared experience. He is a symbol both of the desperation of the afflicted and of the opportunism of those who prospered from their misfortune. Today, he is a testament to how far medicine has progressed and to how inextricably bound up human fear and spectacle remain. Though their reputation was gloomy, tooth pullers were necessary. They provided release from excruciating pain during an era when tooth decay was widespread and sugar use was on the increase. Tooth pullers' profession walked the thin line between medicine and theater, tending to attract spectators who gazed upon the torture as a sidewalk spectacle. Another famous rendering is by Theodore Rombouts, whose 1620-1625 work presents a flamboyant tooth puller with a necklace of removed teeth, a ghoulish badge of experience. These paintings capture society's interest in pain, healing, and spectacle. Now, the tooth puller is a relic of pre-modern medicine, a reminder of desperation, grit, and the human search for relief. In paintings, he is still a haunting figure, reminding us just how far we've traveled, and how deeply pain and performance were once entwined. His theatrical side influenced artists such as Caravaggio, who painted the Tooth Puller in 1609. His Baroque masterpiece freezes the raw emotion of the moment, a patient clutching in agony surrounded. 7. The Illuminator. Illuminators manually decorated manuscripts with elaborate designs, gold leaf, and colorful pictures before the printing press made bookmaking more accessible. Their work was artistic and religious, commissioned primarily by churches and nobles. Illuminators took months to prepare each page, combining calligraphy with miniature painting. Even though their art weakened when mass printing became available, their name lives on in the beauty of existing manuscripts. Illuminators toiled mostly in monasteries or on commission from rich patrons. They worked alongside scribes, who inscribed the text and then adorned the pages with elaborate initials, borders, and miniature paintings. Gold leaf was used to refract light, therefore the name illumination, so the pages shimmered with divine radiance. Psalters, Gospels, and books of hours were standard fare. Religious texts, though secular items, were also illuminated. The work was labor-intensive. Pigments from natural minerals, plants, and insects were combined with egg yolk or gum arabic. Squirrel hair made the brushes, and magnifying glasses assisted with the smallest details. One page might have taken weeks. Although the printing press came to displace the need for illuminated books in the long run, the work of illuminators lives on. It is a combination of art and intellect, piety and rigor. Those manuscripts that have survived are now prized in museums and libraries, giving us a glimpse of the Renaissance mind's appreciation for beauty and significance. 8. The Astrologer. Astrologer has always been at the intersection of science, mysticism, and man's curiosity. From Babylon in ancient times to Renaissance Europe, astrologers had been seen as wise sages who could decipher the heavens and disclose secret truths about fate, personality, and destiny. Astrology in the Renaissance period was a serious intellectual inquiry, usually read together with astronomy and medicine. Astrologers relied on intricate mathematics to follow the movements of planets and their alignments. They did not view their predictions as superstitious, but part of a larger cosmic harmony of understanding. And yet the astrologer was not merely a mathematician. They were interpreters of the cosmos, using cosmic symbolism to tell human stories. Their vocabulary, houses, signs, aspects, provided a context for comprehending the secrets of life. From leading a merchant into a perilous undertaking to informing a noble about favorable dates, the function of the astrologer was at once practical and religious. Boundaries were permeable between mysticism and science, and numerous leading intellectuals, such as Johannes Kepler and Tycho Brahe, indulged in astrology as part of their astronomical work. Astrology had been based on classical traditions for centuries, with heavy reliance on Ptolemaic schema and Arabic learning. Renaissance astrologers inherited these traditions and modified them to fit an acceleratingly changing intellectual landscape. Astrologers frequently advised monarchs and nobles on matters of state. Queen Elizabeth I of England, for instance, depended on her court astrologer John Dee, who was both a mathematician and an alchemist. Dee counseled her on favorable dates for coronations and military campaigns, believing that planetary positions could influence the success of political activities. In Italy, astrologers were hired by powerful dynasties such as the Medici, who recognized celestial insight as a strategic asset. 9. Necessary women. Necessary women were usually from the lower ranks. They did their jobs in both rural and urban areas for very little pay. Their work was unseen but necessary, and they rarely appear mentioned in the records, unless they made a mistake. Despite the unseemly character of the work, it gave some women a measure of independence. In towns, necessary women could service several households, making an honest living. Within great houses, they were in a larger domestic staff hierarchy, usually serving under a housekeeper or steward. Necessary women were not very often represented within art and literature, and then only with contempt or comic hyperbole. Their invisibility in historical writings is indicative of gender and class prejudice in general within their era. But their work was present in each home, and their labor underpinned the domestic order that permitted Renaissance culture to bloom. The work the woman needed to do centered around keeping things clean in an age prior to plumbing, antiseptics, or contemporary cleansing equipment. Her work involved emptying and cleaning chamber pots, usually several times a day, cleaning privies and latrines, which were crude and odoriferous, handling laundry, particularly dirty linen and clothes, excretion of domestic waste, such as food waste and human waste. These were physically exhausting jobs and made her susceptible to disease, filth, and shame. Without her, even the most civilized Renaissance home would have been thrown into disarray. 10. Whinster. Ah, the whinster, a lesser-known but interesting character in the Renaissance labor fabric. Although the title may be poetic-sounding, the occupation itself was far from glamorous. Let's unwind who the whinsters were and why their labor counted. In the active textile economy of Renaissance Europe, whinsters were pivotal in the manufacture of silk, a rare fabric coveted by nobles and merchants both. A whinster was often a woman whose occupational function was to wind silk thread from skeins onto spools or bobbins, ready to be woven or embroidered. This fine, repetitive work demanded patience, accuracy, and a steady hand. Whinsters were predominantly female, frequently working-class women. In urban centers such as Florence, Lyon, and Venice, key production centers for silk, young girls and unmarried women were used in large numbers. Some worked at home, while others toiled in overcrowded workshops under the charge of male overseers. Their pay was minimal, and their position was peripheral. But they were crucial to the thriving textile industry that supported Renaissance economies and style. With the improvements in textile technology and the widespread use of mechanized spinning, the whinster's function started to disappear. By the 18th century, the machines could wind the thread more quickly and efficiently, eliminating many women from employment. But whinsters were essential wheels in the wheel of business and fashion during the Renaissance. 11. Muggler. Pigs in Renaissance Europe were a crucial source of meat, fat, and leather. They were also quite effective garbage disposers, usually being fed scraps and refuse within the household. The muggler was the individual who took charge of these animals, feeding, herding, and preparing for slaughter. In urban settings such as London, Florence, or Paris, mugglers would have to negotiate tight alleys and congested markets. Local governments occasionally implemented rules to manage pig movement, forcing mugglers to exclude animals from particular areas or restrict their quantities. Offenses might lead to fines or public shaming. But pigs were too useful to be banned entirely. Their capacity for eating trash made them a sort of living garbage pail, and the mugglers were the operators of this dirty but profitable system. Their identification with the pig made them vulnerable to mockery, but their labor was actually much more multifaceted than one might have supposed. 12. Pin maker. The pin maker was among the most backbreaking and repetitive Renaissance occupations, typically done by children and low-wage workers. Although pins are now seen as insignificant, during the Renaissance they were ubiquitous tools in clothing and household life, used to hold on clothes, pin up veils, and even sew pages together. Producing these small metal pieces was a surprisingly involved and time-consuming process. Pins were a necessity in Renaissance style. Garments tended to be layered, draped, and closed up without buttons or zippers. Women pinned on bodices, sleeves, and headpieces. Tailors and seamstresses depended on them for fittings and alterations. Pins were also employed in bookbinding, embroidery, and even surgery. They were so common that they became the run-of-the-mill part of everyday life and a consistent source of orders. During a time when there was no mass production, each pin was handmade. Being a pin maker was a multi-step process that needed dexterity, patience, and stamina. It was a typical case of primitive industrial work, long, poorly paid, and exploitative in nature. 13. Thresher. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, mechanical threshers started to emerge, climaxing in the development of the threshing machine, a groundbreaking device that could sort grain much quicker than humans. Threshers were typically temporary laborers, occasionally rented by richer landowners or working within communities of villages. They played a vital role in food production, but were frequently some of the poorest and least privileged rural workers. The Swing Riots, 1830s England. The threshing machines posed a threat to livelihood. Laborers attacked machines and wanted their rights. Riots were brutally suppressed, but the riots reminded everyone of the conflict between human dignity and technological advancement. These occupations show us a world where survival was based on precision, rhythm, and grit, rather than prestige. They were frequently done in a communal manner, learned through generations, and tied to seasonal cycles. But they also bared entrenched inequalities, child labor, exploitation, and exposure of workers to technological obsolescence. As mechanization came to replace human toil, these occupations slipped away into history. But they inherited an ethic of grit and quiet heroism. The pin maker's deft fingers and the thresher's sore shoulders show us that history is not solely created by kings and scholars, but by those who worked in silence behind them. The Renaissance and early modern era were not only times of artistic genius and scientific discovery, but of a secret world of bizarre, brutal work, jobs that powered society in the dark. Of these, the pin maker and the thresher are the most notable as symbols of human resilience in the face of drudgery and adversity. Pin makers, frequently children, made thousands of small metal fasteners manually, suffering eye fatigue, poisonous fumes, and low wages. Theirs was a fine, repetitive work that was crucial to fashion and home life, but mostly hidden and unappreciated. Meanwhile, threshers worked in the fields, swinging flails from early morning to evening to sift grain from chaff. Theirs was a physically brutal, dusty work that was critical to the production of food, but they were ranked lowest in society.